Hello, friends. Did you know that nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy the content, I'd truly appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps a lot. Also, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your interaction not only supports the channel's growth, but also helps these stories reach more people. Thank you all for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. I've worked the Bering Sea approaches for 19 seasons now, and I can tell you that the cold up here does something to a man's perception. Dale Haskett, that's my name, and I run deck operations on a 42-foot longliner that works the waters between Dutch Harbor and the outer islands. The work strips away any romanticism you might have about the ocean. Out here, it's just you and the wind and water that wants to kill you if you give it half a chance. The night it started, we were running a late set about 40 miles northwest of Unalaska. October darkness comes early this far north, and by 4 in the afternoon, you're working under deck lights that turn everything beyond their reach into absolute black. Niels Braddock was on deck with me, a younger guy who'd been working boats for maybe 5 years. Good hands, didn't talk too much, knew when to move fast and when to stay put. That matters more than people think. Ernest Wallach was at the wheel. Ernest had been running boats in these waters since before I was born, and he had that particular kind of silence that comes from seeing too much ocean. He didn't tell stories about the old days. He just worked, and occasionally he'd say something that made you understand he knew things he wasn't sharing. The wind was blowing steady from the northwest, maybe 20 knots, enough to kick up a chop, but nothing that would stop us from working. The temperature was dropping, though, and I could feel ice starting to form on the rails. We'd need to knock it off before it built up enough to affect stability. We were hauling line when Ernest called down from the wheelhouse. His voice had a quality I hadn't heard before, careful and measured in a way that made me stop what I was doing. "Dale, come take a look at this." I climbed up to the wheelhouse, leaving Niels to manage the line. The space was warm compared to the deck, and the instruments glowed green in the darkness. Ernest was staring at the radar screen, his finger pointing to a contact that sat about 2 miles off our port side. "Been there for 20 minutes, he said. "Hasn't moved." I looked at the echo. It was solid. The kind of return you get from something with a good radar signature. Metal hull, probably. But the shape was wrong somehow. Too symmetrical, too perfect. You try raising them on the radio? Twice. Nothing. I watched the screen for a minute. The echo just sat there, not drifting with the current, not moving with the wind. The sea up here pushes everything. Vessels at anchor will swing with the tide. Disabled boats will drift. But this contact was stationary in a way that didn't fit. "Could be a buoy," I said, but I didn't believe it even as the words came out. "No buoys charted for this area," Ernest said. "And the return's too big. That's boat-sized." We watched it for another 10 minutes while we finished hauling the line. The contact never moved, never changed, just sat there returning our radar pulses with mechanical precision. "We going to go look?" I asked. Ernest was quiet for a moment, then he shook his head. "Got another 3 sets to make tonight. Can't be chasing ghosts." But he kept looking at the screen, and I could see something in his expression that I didn't like. Not fear, exactly, but recognition. Like he'd seen this before, and it hadn't ended well. We moved to our next set location, about 5 miles east of the first position. The work took maybe an hour and a half, and when we finished, I climbed back up to the wheelhouse to warm my hands. The radar echo was still there. It had moved with us, maintaining the exact same distance and bearing it had held before. 2 miles off the port side, precisely where it had been. "Ernest," I said, pointing at the screen. He nodded. He'd been watching it. "That's not possible," I said. "We moved 5 miles. How does it stay in the exact same position relative to us?" "It doesn't," Ernest said, "but it does." Niels came up then, his face red from the cold. He looked at the radar screen and frowned. "What's that?" "Don't know," I told him. "Been following us." "Following us how?" I explained. And I watched his expression shift from curiosity to something else. He looked out the window, but of course there was nothing to see. The darkness beyond our lights was complete. We made our third set with that echo sitting 2 miles off our port side. It never wavered, never drifted, just maintained its position like it was connected to us by an invisible tether. Ernest didn't say much, just worked the boat and checked the radar every few minutes. It was close to midnight when we started hauling the third line. The wind had picked up and the temperature had dropped enough that ice was building fast on everything. Niels and I worked quickly, knocking ice off the rails between poles. The line was coming up heavy, which was good, meant we were into fish. Then Niels called out. His voice was sharp, and I turned to see him staring at something caught in the line. Not fish, fabric. I moved closer and helped him pull it free. It was maybe 2 feet square, some kind of synthetic material, dark blue or black. The edges were torn, not cut, and there were rust stains on one corner. The fabric was wet, of course, but when I squeezed it, the water that came out felt different, warmer than it should be. "What is that?" Niels asked. I didn't know. It looked like it might have been part of a tarp, or maybe equipment cover, but the material had a quality that bothered me. It was too clean, too intact. Fabric that's been in the ocean for any length of time shows it. This looked like it had gone in the water maybe hours ago, not days or weeks. "Could have come from anything," I said. But I was thinking about the radar echo. Niels took it from me and examined it more closely. In the deck lights I could see his breath making clouds. "It's still warm," he said. I touched it again. He was right. The fabric held heat in a way that made no sense. We were hauling line from 300 feet of water. Nothing that comes up from that depth is warm. We finished the set and I took the fabric up to the wheelhouse. Ernest looked at it without touching it, and his face did something I'd never seen before. He looked old suddenly, and tired in a way that went beyond physical exhaustion. "Throw it back," he said. "What?" "Throw it back in the water, now." I stared at him. "Ernest, what?" "Dale, I've been working these waters for 43 years. I'm telling you to throw that back, and don't ask me why." There was something in his voice that killed any argument I might have made. I took the fabric back down to the deck and dropped it over the side. It floated for a moment, dark against the black water, then sank. When I came back up, Ernest had changed our course. We were heading east, back toward Dutch Harbor, even though we had 3 more sets planned for the night. "We're going in," he said. Niels started to protest, but I shook my head at him. Whatever was happening, Ernest knew more than he was saying, and I trusted his judgment enough to follow it. We ran for maybe 20 minutes in silence. I kept checking the radar screen and the echo kept pace with us, 2 miles off the port side. Then, without any transition, it was gone. The screen showed empty ocean in all directions. Ernest saw it disappear at the same time I did. He didn't change course, didn't slow down. He just kept driving us east. "You want to tell me what that was about?" I asked after another 10 minutes. Ernest was quiet for so long, I thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, 30 years ago, I was working with a captain named Wallach. Different boat, same waters. We picked up a radar contact that followed us for 6 hours. Never moved from the same position relative to our boat. Captain wanted to investigate, so we changed course to intercept it. He paused, and I waited. When we got to where the echo was supposed to be, there was nothing there. Just empty ocean. But we found fabric in our nets on the next haul. Same kind of material you just threw back. Captain kept it, brought it to port, tried to figure out where it came from. And he disappeared 3 days later. Went out alone in his skiff, said he was going to check something. They found the skiff a week later, capsized, 10 miles offshore. Never found him. The wheelhouse was warm, but I felt cold. You think there's a connection? I think that fabric shouldn't exist. I think whatever that radar contact is, it doesn't want to be found, and it leaves markers for people who get too close. I think some things in these waters have their own rules, and the smart move is to respect that and stay clear. We didn't talk much after that. The run back to Dutch Harbor took 4 hours, and the radar stayed clear. By the time we tied up at the dock, dawn was starting to break over the eastern mountains, and the world looked normal again. We offloaded our catch and secured the boat. Niels asked if we'd be going back out the next night, and Ernest told him no. We'd be staying in port for a few days. Maintenance, he said, but I knew that wasn't it. I went to a bar near the harbor and drank coffee while I tried to make sense of what had happened. The logical part of my brain said it had been an instrument malfunction. Maybe some kind of radar ghost caused by atmospheric conditions. The fabric was just trash that had snagged in our line, and the warmth was imagination or residual heat from something I couldn't explain but which probably had a rational cause. But the part of my brain that had worked the ocean for 2 decades knew better. I'd seen enough strange things to understand that the water keeps secrets. You learn to recognize when you're seeing something that doesn't fit, and you learn to back away from it. I ran into Ernest 2 days later at the fuel dock. He was alone, checking line on his boat. I asked him if he'd reported the radar contact to anyone. No, he said, and neither should you. Why not? He looked at me with eyes that had seen more than I wanted to know about. Because there's no good that comes from drawing attention to things like that. Coast Guard investigates, asks questions, maybe sends people out to look around. Then those people maybe find something, or maybe they don't come back. Either way, it spreads. More people go looking, and the ocean doesn't like being looked at too hard. That's superstition, I said. Call it what you want. I'm telling you how to stay alive up here. I thought about the fabric, about how warm it had been, about the radar echo that had maintained impossible precision for hours, about Ernest's captain who had disappeared 30 years ago. Did other people see it? I asked. Back then, with your captain? 3 of us on that boat. I was the only one who didn't try to figure out where the fabric came from. The other deckhand got curious, started asking around the harbor, trying to identify the material. He went out fishing a month later, and his boat caught fire. Burned to the waterline. They said it was a fuel leak, but I knew better. Ernest finished his line check and stood up, his back cracking. You're a good worker, Dale. You keep your head down, you don't ask stupid questions, you know when to listen. So I'm going to tell you one more thing, and then we're not going to talk about this again. I waited. That radar contact is up there every season. It moves around, but it's always working these waters. Captains who've been around long enough, we all know about it. We call it the echo. You see it on your screen, you change course and you get clear. You don't investigate, you don't try to make contact. You definitely don't keep anything you find in your nets when it's around. The echo marks people. I don't know how and I don't know why, but I've seen it happen enough times to know it's real. Marks them how? They get curious. Start asking questions. Start looking for answers. And then they have accidents. Boats sink, people fall overboard, equipment fails at the worst possible time. Could all be coincidence, but after 43 years, I don't believe in that many coincidences. He climbed off the boat and walked past me without saying anything else. I stood on the dock and watched him go, and I made a decision right then. Whatever the echo was, I was going to do exactly what Ernest said. I wasn't going to ask questions, wasn't going to look for answers, wasn't going to tell anyone what I'd seen. I worked the Bering Sea for 3 more seasons after that night. I saw the echo twice more on radar, both times maintaining that same impossible position off our port side. Both times we changed course and got clear, and both times it disappeared once we were far enough away. Niels left fishing after that season. He said he was going back to school, but I think the echo bothered him more than he wanted to admit. He asked me once a few weeks after that night if I thought we'd really seen something strange or if it had been equipment malfunction. I told him I didn't know, and I suggested he stop thinking about it. I don't work those waters anymore. I moved down to the Washington coast, different fishery, different ocean. The work is easier and the money's not as good, but I sleep better at night. I don't have to wonder if something is watching me from 2 miles away, maintaining perfect distance while I work. Sometimes, though, when I'm out at night and the radar screen shows empty ocean in all directions, I think about that fabric, about how warm it was, how intact, about how it had been in the water but not of it, like something that existed in a different set of rules. And I think about Ernest Captain, who disappeared trying to understand what he'd found, about the deckhand whose boat burned, about all the other people over the years who got too curious about the echo and paid for it. The ocean up there is different. It's older somehow, colder in ways that have nothing to do with temperature. Things move through those waters that don't belong to the world we understand. And the smart ones, the ones who survive, learn to recognize when they're seeing something that shouldn't be seen. I learned that lesson. I learned to change course when the radar shows something that doesn't move with the wind or the current. I learned to throw back anything unusual that comes up in the nets. I learned that some questions don't have answers you want to know. The echo is still up there. Other fishermen see it, though most of them don't talk about it. The ones who do usually don't last long in the fleet. They get reputations as people who see things, and nobody wants to work with someone like that. It's bad luck, people say, though they can't explain what kind of luck or why. But I know. I know because I saw it. Because I held that warm fabric in my hands. Because I watched an old captain's face when he recognized what we'd found. The echo marks people, and the marked ones disappear. That's all the answer I need. The fabric is still down there, somewhere in the dark water between Dutch Harbor and the outer islands. It's waiting to be found by someone who doesn't know better, someone who'll keep it and try to understand it. And when that happens, the echo will follow them home. Will mark them the way it marked Ernest's captain. I hope whoever finds it is smarter than that. I hope they throw it back like I did. And I hope they have someone like Ernest to tell them why. Because the ocean up there doesn't forgive curiosity, and the echo never forgets. The harbor master's office called me on a Tuesday morning in March, which was unusual because Gregor Salcedo doesn't usually warrant personal calls from management. I run a 36-foot gill netter out of Nia Bay, nothing special. Just steady work catching salmon when they're running and taking whatever other jobs come my way during the off-season. I've been working these waters for 14 years, long enough to know most of the people in the fleet, but not long enough to be considered one of the old-timers. Maeve Lind was on the phone. She'd been managing harbor operations for maybe 6 years, efficient and professional in a way that made people trust her judgment. When she asked if I could come to her office before heading out that morning, her voice had a quality that made me change my plans without argument. The office was warm after the cold wind outside, and Maeve had coffee ready, which told me this wasn't going to be a quick conversation. She waited until I was settled before she started talking. You know the D-dock section that's been closed for the past year? I nodded. D-dock was at the north end of the harbor. 6 berths that had been cordoned off with chain-link fencing and warning signs. The official explanation was structural damage, pilings that needed replacement, something about water damage undermining the dock foundation. Work was supposed to start last summer, but had been delayed for reasons nobody seemed clear on. We're getting ready to demolish that section, Maeve said. But before we do, I need someone to go out there and document the current condition. Photos, measurements, basic assessment. The contractor needs it for the permit application. Why me? She looked uncomfortable, which was unusual for her. Because you're not the kind of person who talks much. And because I need someone who can handle unusual situations without making a big deal about it. I waited for her to explain what she meant by unusual. There have been some reports, she said slowly, from the night security. Ari Knutson has been working the overnight shift and he's mentioned hearing things from the D-dock area. Sounds that don't have obvious sources. What kind of sounds? Chain dragging, metal scraping on metal. Sometimes what he describes as splashing, like something moving in the water near the pilings. He's gone to investigate a few times, but he never finds anything. Just empty dock space and dark water. I drank my coffee and considered what she was telling me. You think there's something down there that's going to affect the demolition? I think I want documentation of what's actually there before we tear it down. And I want it done by someone who won't start rumors if they happen to experience anything unexpected. She was being careful with her words, trying to ask me something without saying it directly. I understood the position she was in. Harbor management couldn't officially acknowledge that strange things happened in their facility, but unofficially they needed to know what they were dealing with. I'll do it, I said. But I want Ari to come with me. If he's been hearing things, he knows what to listen for. Maeve agreed, and 2 hours later, Ari and I were standing at the fence that blocked access to D-dock. He was a younger guy, maybe late 20s, who'd taken the security job to make money while he worked on some kind of graduate degree. He had the look of someone who didn't sleep well, and when I mentioned the sounds he'd heard, his expression confirmed it. It's not every night, he said as we opened the gate. Maybe twice a week, usually between midnight and 3 in the morning. The first time I heard it, I thought someone had driven a boat in past the closed section. But there's never anything there. The dock was in worse shape than I'd expected. The planking was rotten in places with gaps that showed dark water below. The pilings were covered in marine growth, and several of them were listing at angles that suggested serious structural problems. The berths were empty, no boats tied up, just cleats and bollards that hadn't been used in over a year. I started taking photos, working my way along the dock while Ari stayed near the entrance. The morning light was gray and flat, and the water had that particular darkness it gets in the Pacific Northwest during late winter. Everything smelled of salt and decay. At the far end of the dock, I found something that made me pause. Scratches on the planking, deep gouges that looked fresh despite the general deterioration of the structure. The marks ran parallel to each other, 4 lines, maybe 2 feet long, like something heavy had been dragged across the wood. But the pattern was wrong, too regular, too deliberate. Ari, come look at this. He walked out carefully, testing the planks before putting his weight on them. When he saw the scratches, his face went pale. That wasn't there before, he said. I've walked this dock twice a week for the past 6 months. I would have noticed. I photographed the marks from multiple angles, then moved to the edge and looked down at the water. The pilings here were more deteriorated than the others, the wood soft and crumbling. But I could see something else, something that didn't fit. There were marks on the pilings about 3 feet below the water line. long, vertical scrapes, like something had been rubbing against them. The marks were clean, recent, cutting through the marine growth to show bare wood underneath. "What would do that?" Ari asked, leaning over to look. I didn't know. Boats tied to pilings will rub against them, but there were no boats here. Floating debris might cause some marking, but not this pattern. Not these clean, vertical lines that suggested deliberate movement. We finished the photo documentation and I took measurements of the dock dimensions for Maeve's report. The work took maybe 2 hours, and by the time we were done, the gray morning had turned into a gray afternoon with rain starting to fall. "You going to mention the scratches in your report?" Ari asked as we locked the gate. I considered that. The honest answer was yes. I needed to document everything I'd observed. But I also understood why Maeve had chosen me for this job. She wanted the work done without creating problems, and scratches that appeared overnight on a closed dock would create exactly the kind of questions she was trying to avoid. "I'll mention deterioration and possible animal activity," I said. "That covers it without being specific." Ari nodded, relief clear on his face. Whatever he'd been experiencing on his night shifts, he didn't want it examined too closely. I delivered my report to Maeve the next morning. She reviewed the photos carefully, pausing when she reached the images of the scratches on the planking and the marks on the pilings. "Animal activity," she said, reading my notes. "Could be." She looked at me for a moment, then closed the file. "The demolition starts next week. Once that dock section is gone, hopefully whatever's been bothering Ari will go with it." I thought about those vertical scrapes on the pilings, about how they cut through marine growth that takes months to accumulate. But I didn't say anything. The demolition was scheduled for the following Tuesday. I happened to be in the harbor that morning, working on my engine, when I heard the construction crew arrive. They spent the first hour setting up equipment and safety barriers, then started cutting through the pilings with saws that echoed across the water. By mid-afternoon, they'd removed the first section of decking. I walked over during my lunch break to see how the work was progressing. The foreman was standing at the edge of the remaining dock, staring down at something in the water. "Problem?" I asked. He looked at me, and I could see he was unsettled. "We just pulled up a section of piling and found something wrapped around it. Chain, looks like, but it goes down deep, and we can't tell what it's attached to." I moved closer and looked where he was pointing. I could see the chain now, thick links that were heavily corroded but still intact. It wrapped around what remained of the piling multiple times, then disappeared into the dark water below. "You going to pull it up?" "Have to. Can't leave it there if we're replacing the pilings. But I don't like it. The chain looks old, really old, and the way it's wrapped, it's not random. Someone put it there deliberately." The crew spent the rest of the afternoon working to free the chain. I watched from my boat, fascinated despite myself. They rigged a winch and started pulling, expecting the chain to come up easily once it was freed from the piling. Instead, it resisted, the winch straining against weight that seemed far heavier than chain alone should be. When it finally came up, water streaming off the links, there was nothing attached to the end. Just chain, maybe 40 feet of it, corroded and covered in marine growth. But the weight had been real. The winch operator said it had pulled like there was something massive on the other end, but when it finally released, there was nothing there. The foreman had the chain laid out on the remaining dock section, and I came over to look at it more closely. The links were hand-forged, old-style construction that hadn't been used in decades. And near one end I noticed something that made my skin crawl. The metal was scratched, deep gouges that matched the marks I'd photographed on the deck planking. 4 parallel lines, deliberate and regular. "You seeing this?" I asked the foreman. He nodded, his face grim. "Yeah, I'm seeing it. And I'm wondering what the hell made marks like that on chain this heavy." The demolition continued for the rest of the week. They found 2 more chains, both similar to the first, both wrapped around pilings in ways that looked intentional rather than accidental. None of them had anything attached, but all of them pulled heavy when the crew tried to remove them. Maeve asked me to stop by her office again on Friday. Ari was there, looking worse than he had before, dark circles under his eyes that suggested he hadn't been sleeping. He heard it again, Maeve said without preamble. Last night, during the demo break, Ari was doing his rounds and he heard the chains. I looked at Ari. Where? Same place. D-Dock. But the dock isn't there anymore. They tore out that whole section. There's nothing but open water where it used to be. His voice was shaking slightly. I heard chain dragging across wood that doesn't exist anymore. And when I went to look, I saw the water moving, not waves, not current. Something under the surface, something big enough to create displacement. Did you report this to anyone else? I asked. Maeve shook her head. He came directly to me, and I called you because I need someone to verify this before I decide what to do. She was asking me to spend a night at the harbor, to witness whatever Ari had been experiencing. I should have refused. I should have told her this was outside my job description, that I was a fisherman, not a night watchman or investigator. But I was curious, and I wanted to understand what those chains had been holding. I met Ari at the harbor that night around 11. The rain had stopped, but the air was thick with moisture, and fog was starting to build over the water. We positioned ourselves where D-Dock had been, now just empty water, with a few remaining pilings that hadn't been removed yet. If it happens, it'll be in the next few hours, Ari said. That's the pattern. We waited in silence, watching the water. The harbor was quiet, just the sound of waves lapping against hulls and the occasional groan of a boat shifting against its fenders. Around midnight, I started to think this was a waste of time, that whatever Ari had heard before wasn't going to repeat itself. Then I heard it, chain dragging across wood. The sound was clear and distinct, metal links scraping over planking with the rhythm of something being pulled slowly. But there was no dock. The sound was coming from empty air above open water, from a structure that had been demolished days ago. I stood up, my heart racing. Ari was already moving toward the sound, his flashlight cutting through the fog. I followed, trying to locate the source. The dragging continued, steady and unhurried, like someone was pulling something heavy toward the water's edge. Then it stopped. The silence that followed was absolute, as if every ambient sound in the harbor had been cut off. I could see my breath in the flashlight beam, could feel my pulse in my throat. The water, where the dock had been, started to move. It wasn't waves. It was something rising from below, creating a swell that pushed outward in concentric circles. I could see the shape of it, massive and dark, just beneath the surface. It moved slowly toward where the dock entrance had been, then stopped. Ari's flashlight beam swept across the water, and for just a moment, I saw something break the surface. Something that looked like metal, curved and smooth, reflecting the light before it sank back down. The water settled. The normal sounds of the harbor returned. The chain dragging had stopped, and whatever had been under the surface was gone. Ari and I looked at each other. Neither of us spoke for a long moment. "What was that?" he finally asked. I didn't know. Metal doesn't rise from deep water on its own. Sound doesn't come from demolished structures. But I'd witnessed both, and I couldn't explain either one. I filed my report with Maeve the next morning. I described what I'd heard and what I'd seen, keeping the language as factual and neutral as possible. I suggested that there might be debris on the harbor floor, possibly from an old wreck or industrial accident, and that it should be investigated before any new construction began. Maeve read the report twice, then looked at me. You believe it was debris? I believe there's something down there that the chains were attached to, and I believe removing the dock disturbed it. Should I call in divers? I thought about that. Thought about what those chains had been holding, about the scratches that suggested something had been trying to get free. Thought about the sound of dragging chain from a dock that no longer existed. No, I said. I think you should leave it alone. Whatever's down there has been there a long time. The chains kept it in place. Now they're gone, and maybe it should stay that way. Maeve was quiet for a moment, then nodded. The new dock construction is being moved to a different location. Engineering decided the foundation issues were too extensive here. We're going to leave this section as open water. She didn't say why the engineering assessment had changed so suddenly, but I understood. Someone had made the decision to leave whatever was in the water undisturbed, and they'd found a bureaucratic justification to support it. The area where D-Dock had been remains empty water. The remaining pilings were removed, but no new construction has started. Ari left the security job a month later. He said he'd finished his degree and was moving to somewhere inland, somewhere without deep water and fog. I still work out of Nia Bay, still run my gill netter during salmon season, but I don't tie up anywhere near where D-Dock used to be. On foggy nights when the harbor is quiet, I sometimes hear chain dragging. The sound is distant, muffled by moisture and darkness, but it's there. Other fishermen hear it too, though most of them don't mention it. The ones who do usually don't stay in Nia Bay long. They move to different harbors, different waters, places where the sounds make sense and the darkness doesn't hold weight. I understand why they leave. But I stay, because this is my home port, and because running from something doesn't make it less real. Whatever was chained to those pilings is free now, and it moves through the water at night, dragging phantom chains across docks that no longer exist. The scratches on the planking were real. The marks on the pilings were real. The chains were real. What they were holding, what they were meant to restrain, that remains unknown, and I've decided I prefer it that way. Some things should stay chained. Some things should remain on the harbor floor, held down by corroded metal and forgotten weight. But the chains are gone now, pulled up by a demolition crew that didn't understand what they were removing. And on foggy nights, when the water is dark and still, something moves through Nia Bay that was never meant to be free. Micah Drummond started noticing something wrong with the current around the third week of September. Not wrong in the sense that it was unusually strong or weak, but wrong in the sense that it was moving water in directions that didn't match what 14 years of fishing the Oregon coast had taught him to expect. He mentioned it to Soren Dubois while they were rigging nets at the Coos Bay dock, trying to put into words a feeling that didn't quite make logical sense. "The pull feels backward," Micah said, tying off a float line, like the water's trying to go somewhere it shouldn't. Soren looked up from the mesh he was mending, his hands moving automatically through the familiar motions. He was 10 years younger than Micah, but had grown up on boats and understood the ocean in the way that only people who work it daily can. "Backward how?" Micah struggled to explain. "You know how the current along this section runs north, especially this time of year? Cold water pushing up from California." Soren nodded. "Last 3 times I've been out, it feels like something's pulling south. Not everywhere, just in patches. Like the normal current is moving one direction, but underneath there's something else pulling the other way. Riptide? No. Riptides you can see, you can feel the surface tension. This is deeper, and it's not consistent. Some days it's there, some days it's not." Soren tied off his repair and examined the net section. "You check your charts? Maybe there's bottom topography you're not accounting for. I've fished these waters for 14 years. I know the bottom. This is different." Soren didn't argue, but Micah could see he was skeptical. And Micah didn't blame him. What he was describing sounded like the kind of thing inexperienced fishermen claimed when they wanted to explain away poor catches or mistakes in navigation. But Micah wasn't inexperienced, and he trusted his instincts about the water. The issue came to a head 2 days later when Micah was running a trawl about 8 miles offshore. The ocean was calm, visibility good, and the weather forecast showed stable conditions for the next 48 hours. Everything about the day suggested it should be routine, productive work. He deployed his nets in an area where he'd successfully fished dozens of times before. The depth here was consistent, around 300 feet, with a mostly flat bottom composition of sand and mud. Good shrimp habitat, reliable catches. He let the net drag for 45 minutes, then engaged the winch to start hauling it back. The net came up wrong. He couldn't articulate exactly how he knew, but the resistance felt different. Nets drag with a particular quality, a weight and tension that experienced fishermen can read like a language. This felt lighter than it should, but also somehow heavier in the wrong places. When the net finally broke the surface, Micah understood why. It was empty. Not a single shrimp, not a fish, not even the usual debris of kelp and jellyfish that always gets caught in the mesh. The net was completely clean, as if it had been dragged through sterile water. And it was covered in mud, not the sandy residue that comes from bottom contact. Thick, black mud that coated the entire net, clinging to the mesh in clumps. The mud had a smell that made Micah step back from the rail. Something organic and wrong, like decay, but not quite. Like something that had been buried and then uncovered. He called Soren, who was working his own boat about 3 miles south. "You getting anything in your nets?" "Yeah, decent haul. Shrimp are running good today. Why?" Mine came up empty, covered in mud. There was a pause. "What depth are you at?" Micah checked his sounder. The display showed 300 feet, same as always. 300. Same spot I always work. "Maybe you snagged something. Old wreck, piece of equipment. Net's intact. If I'd snagged something, there'd be tears. This is like..." Micah stared at the mud-caked mesh. "It's like I dragged it through a mud flat, but I'm in 300 feet of water." "You sure about your depth reading?" Micah looked at the sounder again. The display was clear and consistent. 300 feet. But as he watched, something flickered. For just a moment, the reading changed, showing a depth of 80 feet, then jumping back to 300. "Soren, my sounder's acting strange." "Acting strange how?" "It's jumping, showing different depths in the same location. Could be a malfunction." "When's the last time you had it calibrated?" 3 months ago. It's been working fine." Even as he said it, the display jumped again. 80 feet, then back to 300, then down to 50. Micah pulled up his charts and checked his GPS position. According to the coordinates, he was exactly where he should be, in an area with well-documented bottom depth. There were no sudden drop-offs here, no underwater canyons or ridges that would cause the kind of variation his sounder was showing. He decided to deploy the net again, paying closer attention to how it felt as it went down. The weight dropped normally for the first 200 feet, then suddenly went light, as if it had hit bottom much sooner than it should have. But the sounder still showed 300 feet of water below the hull. He let the net drag for another 30 minutes, then hauled it up. Same result. Empty of sea life, coated in black mud that smelled of things that shouldn't be near the surface. And when he examined the mesh more closely, he found something that made his hands go cold. Mixed in with the mud were fragments. Small pieces of what looked like ceramic or pottery, worn smooth by water but still recognizable as manufactured objects. He picked one piece out of the mesh and rinsed it in a bucket of seawater. It was maybe 2 inches across, with a glaze that had dulled but still showed traces of a pattern. Micah had seen enough salvage to know this was old. Not decades old, but centuries. The kind of thing that comes from shipwrecks or archaeological sites. The kind of thing that should not be in a fishing net 8 miles off the Oregon coast in water that was supposed to be 300 feet deep. He bagged the fragments and cleaned his net as well as he could, though the mud resisted washing and left dark stains on the mesh. The smell lingered too, that decay odor that seemed to get stronger rather than weaker as the afternoon progressed. Tully Redner ran the dock mechanic shop in Coos Bay, and Micah brought his sounder unit to him that evening. Tully was one of those people who could look at any piece of marine electronics and diagnose problems through some combination of experience and intuition. He hooked the sounder up to his diagnostic equipment and ran through a series of tests. "Your unit's working fine," Tully said after 20 minutes. "Calibration is perfect. All the connections are solid. Whatever depth readings it's giving you, they're what it's actually measuring. But they don't match the charts. Then the charts are wrong, or something's changed down there. Bottom doesn't change like that, not in the span of a few weeks." Tully shrugged. "I'm telling you what the equipment says. If you're getting fluctuating depths, either you're moving between areas with different bottom topography, or something is interfering with the signal, but the unit itself is functioning correctly." Micah took the sounder back and spent the evening studying his charts, looking for any notation about unusual bottom conditions in the area where he'd been fishing. There was nothing. The charts showed consistent depth, stable bottom composition, no warnings about magnetic anomalies or equipment interference. He called the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration the next morning and spoke with a survey technician who listened to his description of the depth anomalies with professional interest. "That area hasn't been surveyed in about 15 years, the technician told him. "It's possible there's been some change we haven't documented. Underwater landslides can happen, especially along the continental shelf. Could be you're seeing the results of bottom shift." Would that explain the mud? If there was a slide, yeah. It would stir up sediment, expose layers that have been buried. The fragments you described sound like they might have come from an old wreck site that got uncovered. Any wrecks documented in that area? Let me check. The technician was quiet for a moment, and Micah could hear keyboard typing. Nothing in our database for that specific location, but there are dozens of undocumented wrecks along the Oregon coast. Ships that went down before record-keeping was reliable. Could be you found one. Micah thanked him and ended the call. The explanation made sense logically. An underwater landslide could explain the depth anomalies and the mud. An uncovered wreck could explain the fragments. But it didn't explain the feeling he'd had, that sense of wrongness in the water, that backward pull in the current. He went back out 2 days later, this time with Soren accompanying him. They ran a deliberate survey of the area where Micah had experienced the depth anomalies, taking readings every 100 yards and marking them on a chart. What they found made no sense. The bottom in that area had developed a depression, a bowl-shaped feature that dropped from 300 feet to less than 60 feet at its center, then rose back to 300 feet over the span of maybe 2 miles. The feature was new. Micah had his old charts, some of them dating back 10 years, and none of them showed anything like this depression. "That's not a landslide," Soren said, staring at the sounder readings. "Landslides create slopes, not bowls. What creates bowls? Impact craters. But those don't happen underwater, not in shallow coastal waters." They positioned the boat at the center of the depression, and Micah deployed his net. The familiar wrongness returned immediately, that light, heavy feeling as the net descended. When he hauled it up 30 minutes later, it was coated in the same black mud, carrying the same smell. But this time, there was more than just fragments in the mesh. Tangled in the net was something that looked like rope, except the material was wrong. Too stiff, too heavy. When Micah pulled it free and examined it closely, he realized he was looking at braided metal. Cables, maybe, or woven wire, corroded but still intact enough to show the braiding pattern. That came from something, Soren said. Something that used metal cables. Could be from a wreck. Could be. But why would it be in the middle of a depression that wasn't there 2 weeks ago? They didn't have an answer for that. They spent the rest of the afternoon taking more depth readings, documenting the depression's dimensions. By the time they finished, both of them were convinced something significant had happened down there. Something that had created a new bottom feature and exposed materials that had been buried. Micah reported his findings to the Coast Guard, who forwarded the information to NOAA. A survey ship was dispatched 2 weeks later to conduct a proper mapping of the area. Micah received a call from the survey team leader 3 days after they completed their work. "We confirmed the depression," the team leader said. "It's definitely new, but we can't find any evidence of what caused it. No signs of seismic activity, no indication of landslide. The bottom composition in that area doesn't support crater formation. It's like something scooped out a section of seafloor and left a bowl-shaped void." "What about the materials I found, the fragments and the cables?" "We sent divers down. They collected samples from multiple locations in the depression. Some of what they found matches your description. Pottery fragments, metal cables, other manufactured materials. Dating suggests they're from different time periods. Some pieces are recent, maybe 20 or 30 years old. Others are much older, centuries. How do materials from different time periods end up in the same location?" "That's what we're trying to figure out. The most likely explanation is that there's a debris field down there, materials from multiple wrecks that have accumulated over time. The depression could have formed through some process that collected these materials in one location. What process? We don't know yet. We're still analyzing the data." The survey team's report, when it was finally published, described the depression as an anomalous seafloor feature of unknown origin, and recommended against fishing in the immediate area until more research could be conducted. The depression was added to navigation charts with a notation about unusual bottom conditions. Micah stopped fishing that area. The catches elsewhere were good enough that he didn't need to take risks with water that felt wrong. But he thought about the depression often, about what could scoop out a section of seafloor and leave behind materials from different time periods. Soren developed his own theory. He suggested that maybe there had always been something down there, something heavy enough to sink into the seafloor over time, creating the depression as it settled. And maybe that something had collected debris, dragging down materials from different wrecks and accidents over the decades or centuries it had been sinking. "Like what?" Micah asked. "I don't know. But the cables you found, the braiding pattern, that's industrial. Modern cargo, or maybe military. And the pottery is historical, pre-industrial. Nothing from the same era ends up in the same place unless something brought them together." "You're saying something down there is collecting things?" "I'm saying the distribution pattern doesn't match natural accumulation. It matches collection." Micah didn't like that idea. Didn't like the implication that something at the bottom of the depression was gathering materials, pulling them down into that bowl-shaped void. But he couldn't think of a better explanation that fit the evidence. He heard reports over the following months from other fishermen who'd worked near the depression. Several of them described their nets coming up empty and mud-covered, the same experience Micah had had. One fisherman reported finding clothing in his net, a jacket that looked recent except for the smell. Another found tools, hand-forged implements that looked like they belonged in a museum. The Coast Guard expanded their warning zone around the depression, recommending that all fishing activity avoid the area. Officially, the concern was about possible unexploded ordnance or hazardous materials that might be present in the debris field. Unofficially, nobody wanted to explain what was actually happening down there. Micah's sounder still works perfectly. Tully confirmed it multiple times. But Micah doesn't trust depth readings anymore when he's working waters off the Oregon coast. He's learned that charts can be wrong, that bottom topology can change, and that some things collect in places where they don't belong. The depression is still there. Survey ships check it periodically, documenting its dimensions and collecting samples. The bowl hasn't gotten deeper, but it hasn't filled in either. It just sits there in 300 feet of water, a void that shouldn't exist, holding materials from different eras that shouldn't be together. And sometimes, when conditions are right and the current feels wrong, Micah can sense that backward pull, that feeling of water trying to go somewhere it shouldn't, being drawn towards something that exerts its own gravity, its own rules. He doesn't fish near the depression anymore. But he knows other fishermen who do, drawn by curiosity or stubborn refusal to believe in things they can't explain. Some of them have similar experiences to Micah's. Nets coming up wrong. Mud where there should be sea life. Objects that don't belong. And some of them lose equipment. Nets that don't come up at all. Buoys that disappear overnight. Gear that simply vanishes as if something pulled it down into that bowl-shaped void and decided to keep it. The charts now show the depression clearly, marked with warnings and recommendations. But charts can't show everything. They can't show the feeling of wrongness in the water, the sense that something down there is still settling, still collecting, still pulling things toward it with patient, invisible force. Micah keeps the fragments he found, the pottery pieces in a jar on his shelf. Sometimes he takes them out and examines them, wondering who made them, what ship they came from, how they ended up in a depression that didn't exist 2 weeks before he found them. The smell of decay has faded from the fragments, but the questions remain. And those questions keep Micah awake some nights, staring at his ceiling and thinking about depth readings that fluctuate impossibly, about nets that drag through mud in water that's supposed to be 300 feet deep. The ocean has always kept secrets, but some secrets are deeper than others, and some depths can't be measured by equipment that believes in consistency and natural laws. The depression waits, and whatever made it continues to settle, continues to collect, continues to pull water in the wrong direction. Jonas Fairbairn had been listening to marine radio traffic for most of his adult life, and he understood the language of it the way some people understand music. The rhythms of weather reports, the patterns of fishing coordinates being shared, the distinctive cadence of Coast Guard communications. 17 years working as captain of a 40-foot trawler out of Port Orford had trained his ear to pick up details in radio transmissions that most people would miss, which is why the call on October 7th caught his attention immediately, even though it seemed like a standard distress transmission at first. He was running solo that night, having given his regular mate Del Ray Hollis the evening off. Del Ray had family visiting, and Jonas could handle a simple run on his own. The ocean was calm, visibility good, and he was working familiar waters about 12 miles offshore. The kind of conditions where you could relax slightly, let your mind wander while your hands did the work they'd done 1,000 times before. The transmission came through at 9:43. Jonas noted the time because he was logging his position when the radio crackled to life with the distinctive tone that preceded emergency broadcasts. The voice was male, strained but controlled, speaking English with a slight accent Jonas couldn't quite place. Pacific Islander, maybe, or Southeast Asian. The transmission was weak, breaking up with static, but the essential message was clear. Vessel in distress, engine failure. Taking on water, requesting immediate assistance. The caller gave coordinates that placed them about 15 miles northwest of Jonas's position, and identified their vessel as the Sandra Marie. Jonas grabbed his microphone and responded, acknowledging the distress call and informing the Sandra Marie that he was approximately 30 minutes from their position and could render assistance. He asked them to confirm their coordinates and describe the nature of their emergency in more detail. There was no response, just static. Jonas tried again, broadcasting on multiple frequencies but received no reply. He immediately contacted the Coast Guard at Coos Bay, reporting the distress call and the coordinates. The Coast Guard duty officer acknowledged and said they were dispatching a helicopter and motor lifeboat to the scene. Jonas altered course and increased speed, heading toward the coordinates the Sandra Marie had given. The normal caution he'd feel about responding to a distress call at night was overridden by the clear urgency in the caller's voice. Someone was in trouble, and he was close enough to help. The water was dark beyond his running lights, and the stars were obscured by a high overcast that turned the sky into a featureless gray dome. Jonas kept his radar running, watching for any contacts that might indicate the disabled vessel. The screen showed empty ocean in all directions. He reached the coordinates 40 minutes after the initial call. His spotlight swept across the water, looking for any sign of a boat or debris. There was nothing. The ocean was calm and empty, undisturbed except by the gentle swell that moved across the surface with mechanical regularity. Jonas began a search pattern, circling the coordinates and expanding outward with each pass. The Coast Guard helicopter arrived 20 minutes later, its searchlight cutting through the darkness from above. Together, they covered an area of several square miles, looking for anything that might indicate where the Sandra Marie had been. They found nothing. No boat, no debris, no oil slick, no life jackets or equipment. The water was completely clean, as if no vessel had ever been in distress at those coordinates. The Coast Guard flight officer contacted Jonas and asked if he had any additional information about the call. Jonas described the transmission in as much detail as he could remember, including his impression of the caller's accent and the specific phrasing they'd used. "We have the call recorded," the flight officer said, "but we're not finding any vessel registered as Sandra Marie in our database. No float plans filed for that name out of any Oregon port in the past month." Jonas felt a familiar unease building. Could be using a different home port. Could be the name is wrong or I misheard it. Could be. We'll continue searching for another hour, but if we don't find anything, we'll have to suspend and reclassify this as a false alarm or possible hoax. They searched for 90 minutes total before the Coast Guard helicopter had to return to base for fuel. Jonas stayed for another hour, unwilling to give up while there was any possibility someone was still out there. But eventually, he had to accept that there was nothing to find. He returned to Port Orford exhausted and confused. The call had been clear. The distress had been real in the voice he'd heard, but there was no evidence anyone had been in trouble at those coordinates. Del Rey was at the dock the next morning when Jonas arrived to prep for the day's work. Jonas told him about the distress call and the fruitless search, and Del Rey listened with an expression that suggested he'd heard similar stories before. "You get coordinates?" Del Rey asked. Jonas gave them to him, and Del Rey pulled out his phone, checking something. After a moment, he looked up with a grim expression. "That's near the drop-off, maybe 3 miles from the shelf edge." "So?" "So that's where Raven Ott heard a distress call 2 months ago. Same kind of thing. Vessel in trouble, requesting assistance, gave coordinates near the drop-off. Raven went to help, didn't find anything. Coast Guard searched, came up empty." Jonas felt his skin prickle. "Same vessel? Don't know. Raven didn't mention a name, but same area, same circumstances. Distress call with no boat to be found. Why didn't anyone tell me about this?" Del Rey shrugged. Raven didn't want people thinking he was losing it. He filed his report with the Coast Guard and kept quiet about it otherwise. I only know because he's my cousin and he needed to talk to someone. Jonas spent that evening trying to contact Raven Ott, but the number Del Rey gave him went to voicemail. He left a message asking Raven to call him back, but received no response. 1 week later, October 14th, Jonas was working the same waters, this time with Del Rey on board. They were hauling net around 8 in the evening when the radio transmission came through. Jonas recognized the voice immediately. Same speaker, same accent, same strained but controlled tone. The transmission was identical to the one he'd heard a week earlier, word for word. Vessel in distress, engine failure, taking on water, requesting immediate assistance. Same coordinates, same vessel name, Sandra Marie. Jonas grabbed the microphone, but Del Rey caught his arm. "Wait, just listen." They listened to the entire transmission play out. It ended exactly the way Jonas remembered, cutting off mid-sentence as if power had failed. Then there was static. "That was the same call," Jonas said. "Exactly the same. Every word identical." Del Rey nodded slowly. "Recording has to be. Someone's broadcasting a recording." "Why?" "Don't know. But you need to report this to the Coast Guard. Tell them it's a repeat transmission." Jonas made the call. The Coast Guard duty officer this time was different from the one he'd spoken with a week earlier, and she listened to his report with professional skepticism. She said they would investigate, but suggested that Jonas should not respond to the call unless he could verify it was genuine. "How am I supposed to verify it's genuine?" Jonas asked. "If you can make radio contact with the calling vessel and confirm they're in actual distress. If they don't respond to your attempts at contact, assume it's a false transmission." Jonas understood the logic, but it felt wrong. If there was even a possibility someone was in genuine trouble, ignoring the call because it seemed suspicious could cost lives. He didn't go to the coordinates that night. He stayed at his fishing grounds and completed his work, but he kept the radio on, listening for any additional transmissions. There were none. The pattern became clear over the following weeks. Every 7 days, on the same night of the week, at the same time, the distress call would broadcast. Always identical. Always the same voice, same words, same coordinates. Jonas documented each occurrence, noting that the signal strength varied slightly, but the content never changed. Other fishermen started reporting the transmissions as well. The Coast Guard began tracking them, trying to locate the source. Radio direction-finding equipment suggested the broadcasts were originating from somewhere near the coordinates the caller was giving, but when vessels were sent to investigate, they found nothing. Jonas decided he needed to be at the coordinates when the next transmission occurred. He wanted to see for himself what was there, wanted to understand what could generate a distress call from empty ocean. On October 28th, he positioned his boat at the exact coordinates, arriving 2 hours before the transmission was scheduled to occur based on the pattern he'd documented. Del Rey was with him, and they waited in silence, watching the water and the radar screen. The transmission came through at the expected time. Jonas was watching his radio when it happened, and he saw something that made him go cold. The frequency indicator showed the signal was coming from very close range, less than 100 yards. He grabbed his spotlight and swept it across the water in all directions. There was nothing. No boat, no buoy, no floating equipment. Just empty ocean. But the radio direction finder was indicating the source was right there, almost on top of them. The transmission ended, and Jonas tried to respond, tried to make contact with whatever was generating that signal. There was no response except static. Del Rey was checking the depth sounder. "Jonas, look at this." The sounder was showing something Jonas had never seen before. The bottom depth read 350 feet, which was correct for this location. But there was something else on the display, a suspended return about 100 feet down, something in the water column, something substantial enough to create an echo. "What is that?" Jonas asked. "Don't know. Too big to be a school of fish, wrong shape." They watched the suspended return for several minutes. It didn't move, just hung there in the water like something waiting. Then, slowly, it started to descend. The echo moved down on the sounder display, sinking towards the bottom at a rate of maybe 10 feet per minute. Jonas made a decision. "We're going to mark this location and come back with sonar. I want to know what's down there." They deployed a marker buoy, a bright orange float with a radar reflector that would make it easy to find again. As they were preparing to leave, the suspended return on the sounder reached the bottom and disappeared from the display. 2 days later, Jonas hired a survey technician with side-scan sonar equipment. They returned to the marker buoy and conducted a detailed scan of the area, looking for anything that might explain the suspended return and the repeating distress calls. The sonar images showed the bottom in high resolution, revealing details of the seafloor topology. At the coordinates where Jonas had detected the suspended return, the sonar showed something that didn't fit the surrounding geology. It was a crater. Not large, maybe 30 feet across, but distinct and clearly artificial in origin. The crater was circular, with raised edges that suggested something had impacted the bottom with significant force. Inside the crater, the sonar showed scattered debris, metal fragments, possible equipment, shapes that might have been structural components. "That's a crash site," the technician said, studying the sonar images. "Something came down hard and buried itself in the bottom. Recent. Can't tell from sonar alone, but the edges are still defined, haven't been eroded by current. If I had to guess, I'd say less than a year old. Maybe less than 6 months." Jonas stared at the images. A crash site would explain debris, but it wouldn't explain repeating distress calls. Unless, could there be equipment down there that's still functioning? Something battery-powered that's broadcasting automatically? The technician considered that. Emergency beacons can run for weeks on battery power. If there's a transmitter down there and it's somehow waterproofed and still has power, it could be broadcasting. But the coordinates the distress call gives are the coordinates where we're finding the crash site. That's too coincidental. Unless whoever was broadcasting knew they were going down, knew they were about to crash and gave their position before they hit the water. The technician nodded slowly. That would make sense. Final distress call, giving position, then impact. Transmitter continues broadcasting the last message on repeat until the battery dies. Jonas reported his findings to the Coast Guard. They sent divers to investigate the crash site. What they found raised more questions than it answered. The debris field contained fragments that appeared to be from an aircraft. Small pieces of aluminum skin, bits of wiring, components that might have been from avionics systems. But there was no large wreckage, no major structural pieces. It was as if whatever had crashed there had been almost completely destroyed on impact or had subsequently disintegrated. The divers found no bodies, no personal effects, nothing that would identify who had been in the aircraft or where it had come from. They did recover what they believed was a transmitter, a waterproof unit that was still broadcasting when they brought it to the surface. The Coast Guard technicians deactivated it, and the repeating distress calls stopped. Analysis of the transmitter showed it was commercial aviation equipment, the type used in emergency locator beacons. The unit had been damaged but remained functional, continuously broadcasting its last recorded message. The message was the distress call Jonas and others had been hearing, but there were problems with this explanation. The transmitter's battery shouldn't have lasted as long as it had. Based on the power consumption and battery capacity, it should have died after maybe 3 weeks of continuous operation. Yet it had been broadcasting for at least 2 months, possibly longer, and the aircraft wreckage didn't match any missing plane reports. The Coast Guard and FAA conducted an extensive search of their records, looking for any aircraft that had disappeared or been reported missing in the Pacific Northwest over the past year. They found nothing that matched the debris or the crash location. "It's like something came down that was never reported missing," the Coast Guard investigator told Jonas. "Or came down from somewhere we don't have records for." Jonas didn't know what that meant, and the investigator couldn't explain it either. The debris was real, the transmitter was real, the crash site was real, but there was no official record of what had crashed or who had been aboard. The distress calls stopped after the transmitter was recovered. The water near the coordinates returned to normal, empty ocean, with nothing unusual about it except the crater on the bottom and the debris field that nobody could identify. Del Rey had his own theory, which he shared with Jonas one evening while they were working their nets. Maybe it wasn't from anywhere around here. Maybe it came from somewhere else and went down before anyone knew it was in trouble. From where? Jonas asked. Somewhere that doesn't file flight plans. Somewhere that doesn't want their aircraft tracked. Jonas understood what Del Rey was suggesting. Smuggling flights, illegal operations, aircraft that flew below radar and avoided official reporting. It would explain why there were no missing plane reports, why the wreckage couldn't be identified. But it didn't explain the transmitter's impossible battery life or the precise coordination of the crash location with the distress call coordinates. And it didn't explain the feeling Jonas had whenever he thought about that suspended return on his depth sounder, that something had been hanging there in the water, waiting, before slowly descending to the bottom. The crater is still there. Survey ships have documented it, mapped it in detail. The debris has been partially recovered, though much of it remains on the seafloor. No official conclusion has been reached about what crashed or why. Jonas still works those waters, still passes near the coordinates where the distress calls originated. He doesn't hear the broadcasts anymore, but sometimes, on quiet nights when he's working alone, he thinks about that voice, the strained but controlled tone, the accent he couldn't place, the exact same words repeated for weeks. Someone was in that aircraft when it went down. Someone gave their final position, their final message, knowing they were about to hit the water. And their last words kept broadcasting long after they were gone, kept calling for help that would never arrive. The ocean took them and held them. The crater marks where they fell, and the debris field marks what was left. But their voice continued, trapped in electronic memory, repeating the same plea until someone finally found the transmitter and made it stop. Jonas wonders sometimes if that was the right thing to do. If maybe the voice should have kept broadcasting, kept marking that location, kept telling anyone who would listen that something came down in these waters and was never found, that someone fell from the sky into the ocean and nobody knows who they were or where they were trying to go. The silence now feels wrong as the repeating call had felt. As if stopping the broadcast erased something important, removed evidence that needed to remain. But the transmitter sits in a Coast Guard evidence locker, deactivated and silent. The crater slowly fills with sediment. The debris slowly corrodes, and the voice that called for help from empty ocean is gone, leaving only questions that nobody seems interested in answering. Jonas keeps his own recordings of the distress calls, audio files stored on his phone. Sometimes he plays them back, listening to that voice, trying to hear details he might have missed before, trying to understand what happened in those final moments before impact, what the speaker knew, what they were trying to communicate beyond the standard distress message. The water keeps its secrets well, and some voices, once silenced, are never heard again. Cole Marin had been running commercial diving operations off the Northern California coast for 11 years. and he'd learned to trust the instincts of the people who went underwater for him. Good divers developed a sense about water conditions, about when something felt wrong even if all the instruments showed normal readings. Ronan Wexler was one of those divers, methodical and cautious in ways that kept him alive in a profession where mistakes were permanent. Which is why Cole paid attention when Ronan surfaced from a routine inspection dive in November and said they needed to talk privately, away from the rest of the crew. They were working a contract for a timber company, inspecting the pilings of an old dock structure about 5 miles north of Crescent City. The dock had been built in the 1940s and hadn't been maintained properly in decades. The company wanted to know if the pilings were salvageable or if the whole structure needed to be torn down and rebuilt. Simple work, the kind of job Cole's small operation handled regularly. Ronan had been down for 40 minutes, documenting the condition of the pilings with underwater cameras and taking notes on a slate. When he came up, his ascent was controlled and normal, no signs of panic or emergency. But his eyes had a quality Cole had seen before in divers who'd experienced something they couldn't easily explain. They moved to the far side of the boat, out of earshot of the other crew members. Ronan pulled off his hood and mask, his face pale despite the exertion of the dive. "There's something in the water down there," Ronan said quietly. "Something making sounds I've never heard before." Cole waited for him to continue. It started maybe 20 minutes into the dive. I was working on the north section of pilings, maybe 30 feet down. The visibility was decent, maybe 15 feet. I could hear the normal sounds, waves above me, my breathing, the boat hull creaking. Then I heard something else. What kind of something? Clicking, but not like dolphin clicks or whale sounds. This was mechanical, regular, like something turning on and off with precise timing. Ronan paused, organizing his thoughts. It was coming from deeper water, beyond the pilings. I turned my light toward the sound, but I couldn't see anything. The clicking continued for maybe 5 minutes, then stopped. Could have been equipment. Something on the dock structure moving with the current. That's what I thought at first. But then it started again, and this time it was closer. Still beyond my visibility range, but definitely closer than before. And Cole, the pattern was complex. Not just regular intervals. There were variations, like... He struggled for words. Like it was structured, like language. Cole felt a familiar unease building. He'd been around diving operations long enough to know that sound underwater could be deceptive. Distance and direction were hard to judge, and ordinary noises could sound strange when filtered through water and distorted by temperature layers. But Ronan wasn't someone who jumped to conclusions or made dramatic claims about unusual experiences. "You think it was biological?" Cole asked. "I don't know what it was, but whatever it was stopped when I ascended, like it was responding to my movement." Cole considered their options. They had another 6 pilings to inspect before the job was complete. He could pull Ronan off the dive and send someone else down, but that would mean bringing in another diver and explaining why, which would spread whatever story Ronan had to tell. Or he could trust Ronan's judgment and finish the job, with the understanding that if the sounds occurred again, they'd abort the contract and leave. "You comfortable going back down?" Cole asked. Ronan nodded slowly. "Yeah, but I want someone on standby. If something happens, I want to be able to get out fast." They rigged a safety line and Cole positioned himself at the surface controls, ready to pull Ronan up if needed. Ivor Paxton, their surface tender who'd been watching from the other side of the boat, came over and asked what was happening. "Ronan heard something down there," Cole said, keeping his voice neutral. "We're taking extra precautions for the rest of the dive." Ivor didn't ask for details, which Cole appreciated. Ivor had worked boats for 30 years and understood that sometimes divers experience things that didn't need to be discussed in front of the whole crew. Ronan went back down to continue the inspection. Cole watched the dive timer and monitored the air supply, tracking Ronan's depth and bottom time. Everything proceeded normally for the first 15 minutes. Then Ronan's voice came through the communication system, tight with tension. "Cole, the clicking is back. It's much closer now. Can you see what's making it?" "Negative. Visibility is the same, but I can tell it's close. Maybe 10 feet beyond what I can see. It's circling." "Circling?" "The sound is moving, coming from different directions. Like something is moving around the pilings, staying just outside my visual range." Cole's hand moved to the emergency ascent control. "You want to come up?" There was a pause. Cole could hear Ronan's breathing through the communication system, steady but faster than normal. "Not yet. I want to see what this is." "Ronan, give me 5 more minutes. I'm going to move toward the sound, see if I can get a visual." Cole didn't like it, but he understood the impulse. Divers who spent enough time underwater developed a need to understand what they were experiencing, to confirm that their perceptions matched reality. 5 minutes, then you're coming up whether you want to or not. Cole watched the timer. He could hear Ronan's breathing and occasional sounds of movement, but no communication. The clicking sounds must have continued because Ronan didn't report that they'd stopped. 4 minutes passed, then Ronan's voice came through, barely above a whisper. "Cole, I can see it. What is it?" I can't describe it. It's not biological. It's not equipment. It's just there, in the water, moving." "Ronan, you need to be more specific." "I am being specific. It doesn't look like anything I can reference. It's like watching something that's partially there and partially not. The shape keeps changing, but the clicking is definitely coming from it." Cole made the decision. "Surface now. We're done with this dive." "Copy that. Ascending." Cole monitored Ronan's ascent, making sure he was coming up at a controlled rate. The depth gauge showed steady progress, 30 feet, 25, 20. Then it stopped. "Ronan, why are you holding at 20 feet?" No response. "Ronan, report." The communication system carried sound but not words. Cole could hear breathing, could hear what might have been Ronan's regulator hissing, but no voice. "Ronan, if you can hear me, tug the safety line twice." Nothing. Cole looked at Ivor. "Something's wrong. Help me pull him up." They grabbed the safety line and started hauling. The weight felt normal, consistent with the diver in full gear. But there was no resistance, no indication that Ronan was controlling his own ascent. They pulled steadily until Ronan's head broke the surface. He was conscious, his regulator still in his mouth, his eyes open, but he wasn't moving. He floated at the surface like a piece of equipment, his body positioned correctly but completely passive. Cole and Ivor pulled him to the boat and got him aboard, removing his gear and checking him for injury. There was no physical trauma, no cuts, no bruising, no signs of oxygen deprivation or decompression sickness. Ronan's vital signs were normal. His pupils responded to light. His breathing was regular, but he wouldn't speak, wouldn't respond to questions, wouldn't move unless they physically positioned him. Cole called for a Coast Guard medevac. While they waited, he tried repeatedly to get Ronan to communicate, to show any sign of awareness beyond the basic involuntary responses. Ronan's eyes would track movement, would follow Cole's face as he moved, but there was no recognition in them, no indication that Ronan understood what was happening. The medevac helicopter arrived 30 minutes later and transported Ronan to a hospital in Crescent City. Cole followed in the boat, his mind racing through possible explanations. Nitrogen narcosis shouldn't persist after surfacing. Oxygen toxicity would have shown symptoms during the dive. Head injury was ruled out by the lack of physical trauma. The hospital doctors were as confused as Cole was. Every test they ran came back normal. Neurologically, Ronan appeared fine. Brain scans showed no damage, no anomalies. Physically, he was healthy, but he remained unresponsive, his eyes open and tracking movement, but showing no sign of conscious thought or intentional action. Cole sat with him for hours, trying to understand what had happened. He thought about the clicking sounds, about Ronan's description of seeing something that was partially there and partially not. He thought about how the communication had cut out, how Ronan had stopped ascending at 20 feet. On the second day, Ronan's motor functions began returning. He could move his limbs when instructed, could follow simple commands, but he still wouldn't speak, and his eyes still held that empty quality, as if the person who had been Ronan Wexler had gone somewhere else and left only the body behind. The doctors called it a dissociative fugue state, possibly triggered by extreme stress or a traumatic experience. They said it was rare, but not unheard of in diving accidents. The fact that there was no physical cause made it difficult to treat, but they expected him to recover over time. Cole wasn't satisfied with that explanation. Ronan had been diving in conditions that weren't particularly stressful. 30 feet of depth, clear water, routine work. There had been no equipment failure, no emergency, nothing that would trigger the kind of psychological break the doctors were describing. He went back to the dock site with Ivor 3 days later, intending to complete the inspection himself. He'd brought underwater recording equipment, audio sensors that could capture sounds below the surface. He wanted evidence of what Ronan had heard, something concrete that might explain what had happened. Cole descended to 30 feet and positioned himself at the north section of pilings where Ronan had been working. The visibility was good, the water calm. He could see the pilings stretching down into deeper water, their surfaces covered in barnacles and kelp. He waited, listening. The underwater environment was not silent. There were always sounds, the creak of boat hulls, the rush of current, the distant rumble of waves. But Cole was listening for something else, something regular and mechanical. 10 minutes into the dive, he heard it. The clicking started faint, coming from deeper water. Cole activated his recording equipment and held still, trying to identify the source. The clicking was exactly as Ronan had described it. Regular, but complex with patterns that suggested structure rather than random noise. Cole turned his light toward the sound, sweeping the beam through the water. He could see maybe 20 feet in the current conditions, but beyond that was only blue-green obscurity. The clicking grew louder, closer. Then Cole saw movement. Something in the water, beyond the edge of his visibility. Something that reflected his light in a way that didn't match the usual scatter of suspended particles. It was there for just a moment, a shape that his brain couldn't quite process. Then it moved and disappeared into the deeper water. The clicking stopped. Cole waited for several more minutes, his heart rate elevated, his breathing carefully controlled. The clicking didn't resume. Whatever he'd seen, or almost seen, had withdrawn, leaving only the normal sounds of underwater environment. He surfaced with his recording equipment and reviewed the audio files. The clicking was clearly captured, the pattern obvious and undeniable. Cole sent the files to a marine biologist friend who specialized in underwater acoustics, asking for identification. The response came back 2 days later. The biologist couldn't identify the sounds. They didn't match any known marine animal vocalizations, didn't correspond to any mechanical sources he was familiar with. The pattern was complex enough to be biological, but the regularity suggested mechanical generation. His conclusion was that the sounds were anomalous and would require further study to classify. Ronan began speaking again on the 7th day after the incident. His first words were to a nurse who was checking his vital signs. He asked where he was and what day it was. When the nurse told him, he seemed confused, unable to account for the missing time. Cole visited him that afternoon. Ronan recognized him immediately and asked what had happened, why he was in the hospital. Cole explained about the dive, about how Ronan had surfaced unresponsive, about the days he'd spent in a fugue state. Ronan had no memory of any of it. The last thing he remembered was hearing the clicking sounds and deciding to move toward them to get a visual. Everything after that was blank, as if someone had excised 7 days of his life from his memory. "Did I see anything?" Ronan asked. "Did I tell you what was making the sounds?" Cole repeated what Ronan had said over the communication system before going silent. Something partially there and partially not. Something with a shape that kept changing. Ronan listened and shook his head. "I don't remember saying that. I don't remember seeing anything." "What do you remember?" "The clicking. Moving toward it. And then nothing, just blank space until I woke up here." The doctors kept Ronan for observation for another week before releasing him. Physically, he had recovered completely. Mentally, they said he seemed stable, though they recommended ongoing therapy to address the memory loss and the psychological impact of the incident. Ronan never went diving again. He told Cole he couldn't explain why, but the thought of going underwater now filled him with a fear he couldn't rationalize or overcome. Cole understood and didn't push. Some experiences changed people in ways that couldn't be undone. The timber company's dock inspection was completed by a different diving contractor. Cole provided them with his documentation and his recordings of the underwater sounds. He warned them about what had happened to Ronan, though he kept the description vague enough not to sound irrational. The new contractor reported no unusual sounds during their dives. They completed the inspection without incident and recommended that the dock structure be demolished due to extensive deterioration of the pilings. Cole kept Ronan's dive footage, the video recorded by the helmet camera during that final dive. He reviewed it multiple times, studying every frame for clues about what had happened. The footage showed the pilings, the water, the limited visibility. And in the last few seconds before Ronan's ascent, there was something else. A darkness in the water, beyond the edge of the visible range. Not a shape exactly, but an absence of light that moved against the current. It was there for maybe 3 seconds, then the camera angle shifted as Ronan began ascending and it disappeared. Cole had the footage analyzed by video experts, asking if they could enhance the dark area, bring out details that might be hidden in the low light conditions. The enhanced images showed something that made Cole wish he hadn't asked. The darkness had structure. Not biological structure, not mechanical structure, but something in between. Patterns that looked almost geometric but that violated the rules of geometry. Lines that curved in ways that shouldn't be possible. Shapes that folded into dimensions the camera shouldn't have been able to record. The expert who did the enhancement called Cole and asked where the footage had been recorded. When Cole told him, the expert was quiet for a long moment. "I've seen something like this before," he finally said. "Not exactly like this, but similar. In deep water, footage from ocean floor surveys. Places where the depth is extreme and the pressure is crushing. There are things down there that don't photograph correctly, that appear on camera as distortions or absences rather than objects. What are they? Nobody knows. The prevailing theory is that there's some form of marine life that exists at pressures too extreme for normal biological structures. Things that have adapted to deep water in ways we don't understand. But the patterns in your footage, those don't look biological." Cole asked what they did look like. The expert couldn't answer or wouldn't. He simply said that the footage showed something that should probably be studied by people with more specialized knowledge. And then he ended the call. Cole never released the footage publicly. He kept it stored on a secure drive, along with the audio recordings of the clicking sounds. Ronan knew the footage existed but said he didn't want to see it. Whatever he'd encountered had taken 7 days of his life and left him unable to return to the work he'd done for a decade. That was enough. The dock structure was demolished the following spring. The pilings were pulled up and removed, leaving only open water where the old structure had stood. The timber company built their new dock at a different location, about a mile south of the original site. Cole still runs diving operations along the Northern California coast. He takes contracts for inspection work, salvage operations, underwater construction support. But he doesn't work in the area where Ronan lost his memory. He marks it on his charts as a no-dive zone, and when clients ask why, he tells them the bottom conditions are unsuitable. Most clients accept that explanation. A few ask for more details, and Cole tells them there have been safety incidents in that area, that divers have reported unusual conditions. He doesn't mention the clicking sounds or the shape that exists partially in the water and partially somewhere else. Ronan moved away from the coast after his recovery. He found work as an equipment technician, staying dry and far from deep water. He calls Cole occasionally, asking about diving conditions and news from the fleet. They don't talk about what happened on that November dive, but the subject is always there between them. Unspoken, but understood. Whatever was in the water that day is still there. The clicking sounds have been reported by other divers, though not frequently enough to draw official attention. Most of them describe it as unusual but not threatening, and they surface without incident. But Cole wonders if that's just luck, if maybe Ronan got closer to the source than others have, saw more than he should have. The darkness at the edge of visibility remains. The patterns that shouldn't exist on camera remain. And somewhere in the water off Crescent City, something continues to click with mechanical precision, marking time according to rules that have nothing to do with human understanding of sound or structure. Cole thinks about it sometimes, late at night when sleep won't come. He thinks about Ronan's blank eyes, about 7 days of missing memory, about footage that shows impossible geometry in dark water. And he wonders what would have happened if Ronan had gotten just a little closer, had seen just a little more clearly. Some questions don't need answers. Some things in the water are better left at the edge of visibility, acknowledged but not investigated. The ocean keeps its secrets for reasons, and the secrets keep the ocean separate from the world above. Cole has learned to respect that separation, and Ronan, wherever he is now, has learned that some experiences mark you forever, even when you can't remember them. Silas Murgatroyd noticed the lighthouse was wrong before he even understood what he was seeing. 22 years working the waters off San Simeon had trained his eyes to read the horizon automatically, to use the lighthouse at Point Sur as a reference without conscious thought. The light flashed every 15 seconds, reliable as a heartbeat, and Silas used it to orient himself during night fishing runs the way other people used stars. Except on the night of December 3rd, the rhythm was off. Silas was running his boat about 6 miles offshore, working a productive spot where lingcod congregated near rocky bottom structure. Tilda Behringer was with him, handling the lines while Silas managed the boat. Tilda had been working boats for 5 years, quiet and competent. The kind of crew member who anticipated needs before you had to speak them. The light caught Silas's attention during a lull in the work, one of those moments when you're waiting for a line to settle and your mind wanders. He found himself watching the lighthouse without meaning to, counting the interval between flashes in his head. 10 seconds, then another flash. 10 seconds, flash. "Tilda," he said, "when's the last time you saw Point Sur Lighthouse?" She looked up from coiling line. "Couple nights ago." "Why? You remember the timing? How often it flashes?" 15 seconds, I think, standard lighthouse pattern." "Watch it now. Tell me what interval you count." They both watched in silence, counting in their heads. The light flashed with mechanical precision, but the interval was 10 seconds, not 15. 5 seconds faster than it should be. "That's not right," Tilda said slowly. "Is it broken?" "Don't know, but it's been consistent at 10 seconds for the past 20 minutes. I've been noticing it." Silas pulled out his phone and looked up the lighthouse information. The official documentation confirmed what he already knew. Point Sur lighthouse flashed every 15 seconds, had done so since it was automated in 1972. The timing was controlled by precise electronic systems that were monitored and maintained regularly. "Could be our perception," Tilda suggested. "Maybe the air conditions are making it seem faster." Silas shook his head. "I can count. 10 seconds is 10 seconds. That light is flashing faster than it should." He tried calling the Coast Guard station at Monterey, but couldn't get through. Cell service was intermittent this far offshore, and his marine radio was line-of-sight limited. He made a note to report the timing anomaly when they returned to port. They continued fishing for another 2 hours, and Silas kept checking the lighthouse periodically. The interval remained consistent at 10 seconds, but then, around 11 o'clock, something else started happening. The light began flashing in patterns. Not regular intervals anymore, but sequences. 3 quick flashes, pause, 2 flashes, pause, 1 flash, longer pause. Then the pattern would repeat. Silas grabbed a notebook and started recording the sequences, writing down the number and duration of flashes. "Tilda, you seeing this?" She moved to where she could watch the lighthouse clearly. "Yeah, that's not normal lighthouse behavior." "No, it's not." They watched for 10 minutes while Silas documented the pattern. It never varied. 3 flashes, 2 flashes, 1 flash, long pause, over and over. It looked deliberate, like someone was controlling the light manually, sending a signal. "Could be maintenance," Tilda said. "Maybe they're testing the system." At 11 o'clock at night, and why would they test it by making it flash in patterns? That's going to confuse every ship using it for navigation. Silas tried the radio again, broadcasting on the standard Coast Guard frequency. This time, he got through, reaching a watch officer who listened to his report with obvious skepticism. "Sir, I can assure you that Point Sur Lighthouse is functioning normally," the officer said. "We have direct monitoring of the system, and it's showing standard 15-second intervals." "I'm watching it right now," Silas said. "It's flashing in a pattern. 3 flashes, 2 flashes, 1 flash, pause. It's been doing this for 10 minutes. There was a pause while the officer presumably checked something. "Our systems are not showing any anomaly. The lighthouse is operating at standard parameters." "Then your systems are wrong. Or something's interfering with the light between the lighthouse and my position." "What's your position?" Silas gave his coordinates. The officer was quiet for a moment, then said, "We'll send someone to investigate in the morning. In the meantime, please don't rely on the lighthouse for navigation if you believe it's malfunctioning." The transmission ended. Silas looked at Tilda, frustrated. "They think I'm imagining it." "We're both seeing it," she said. "That's not imagination." The pattern continued for another hour, then suddenly stopped. The light returned to regular flashing, but the interval was now 12 seconds. Not the correct 15, not the 10 it had been earlier, but 12. Consistent and steady at 12 seconds. Silas finished his fishing run and headed back to San Simeon, arriving at the dock around 3 in the morning. He was exhausted, but too unsettled to sleep. Instead, he drove to a coffee shop that opened early and sat with his notebook, reviewing the pattern sequences he'd recorded. 3 flashes, 2 flashes, 1 flash. The timing between flashes in each sequence was also consistent, maybe a second between individual flashes within a sequence. The pause between sequences was longer, approximately 6 seconds. It looked like code. Morse code used different duration flashes to represent letters, but this didn't match Morse patterns. It was simpler, just counting. 3, 2, 1, over and over. Kellen Hoyle found him there around 6 o'clock. Kellen worked as the port warden for San Simeon, responsible for harbor operations and safety oversight. He sat down across from Silas without being invited and ordered coffee. "Heard you called the Coast Guard last night," Kellen said. "Reported the lighthouse acting strange. How'd you know about that?" "Coast Guard contacted me this morning, asked if any other vessels had reported problems. I said no, but I wanted to talk to you before I filed any official response." Silas showed Kellen his notebook, explaining what he and Tilda had witnessed. Kellen listened carefully, his expression neutral. "You know what your reputation is in this harbor," Kellen said when Silas finished. "You're the guy who doesn't make things up, doesn't exaggerate catches or invent excuses. If you say you saw something, people generally believe you. But claiming a lighthouse is sending coded messages is going to test that reputation. You understand that, right? I'm not claiming anything. I'm reporting what I observed. The lighthouse was flashing in patterns that don't match its documented behavior. That's a fact, and it needs to be investigated." Kellen nodded slowly. "Coast Guard is sending a technician to Point Sur today. They'll inspect the equipment and verify everything is operating correctly. In the meantime, I'd suggest you keep this quiet. Don't spread it around the harbor until we know more." Silas agreed, though he didn't like being told to keep quiet about something he'd witnessed. He went home and slept for a few hours, then returned to his boat in the afternoon to prep for another evening run. Tilda was already there, working on equipment maintenance. She looked up when Silas arrived, her expression troubled. "I told my roommate about last night," she said. "About the lighthouse. She works at the Marine Center, knows people who study ocean conditions. She said something interesting." "What?" "There have been reports of unusual whale behavior off Point Sur over the past month. Humpbacks moving in patterns that don't match their normal migration routes. Staying in areas they shouldn't be in, vocalizing at frequencies they don't normally use." "What does that have to do with the lighthouse?" "Maybe nothing. But she said the researchers have been trying to figure out what's causing the behavior change. They've ruled out most environmental factors. Water temperature is normal, food supply is adequate. Whatever's affecting the whales, it's something they can't easily measure." Silas thought about that. Whales were sensitive to sound, to electromagnetic fields, to things humans couldn't directly perceive. If something was affecting whale behavior in the area around Point Sur, maybe it was also affecting the lighthouse systems. Or maybe the lighthouse was the thing causing the whale behavior. That thought bothered Silas more than he wanted to admit. Lighthouses didn't affect wildlife. They were passive systems, just lights rotating according to precise timings. But if the light was flashing in patterns that shouldn't be possible, maybe it was also producing other effects that weren't immediately obvious. They went out again that evening, taking the same route toward the fishing grounds. Silas paid close attention to the lighthouse as they departed, watching for any sign of irregular behavior. The light flashed every 15 seconds, exactly as it should. Normal. Reliable. The way it had been for decades. They fished for several hours without incident. The water was calm, the catches good. Silas started to think that maybe the previous night had been an anomaly, some temporary glitch in the lighthouse system that had been corrected. Around 10 o'clock, he was ready to call it a night and head back to port. Then the pattern started again. This time, it was different. Not 3, 2, 1. This time it was 5 flashes, pause, 3 flashes, pause, 1 flash. Longer pause. Then the sequence repeated. 5, 3, 1. Silas grabbed his notebook and started recording. Tilda abandoned her work and came to watch, her face pale in the reflected light from the instruments. "It's counting again," she said, "but different numbers." "Yeah." Silas tried to find meaning in the sequence, 5, 3, 1. Was it counting down? Was it trying to communicate something specific? The pattern continued for 45 minutes, then changed again. This time it was 2 flashes, pause, 2 flashes, pause, 2 flashes, pause, repeat, 2, 2, 2. "This is deliberate," Tilda said. "Something is controlling that light." Silas radioed the Coast Guard again. This time he got a different officer, someone who sounded more interested in his report. Silas described the new patterns and emphasized that this was the second night of anomalous behavior. "We had a technician at Point Seward today," the officer said. "He confirmed all systems are operating normally, electronic controls are functioning correctly, timing mechanisms are accurate. There's no evidence of malfunction or tampering." "I'm watching the light right now," Silas said. "It's flashing in a pattern of 222. That's not 15-second intervals. Hold on." There was a long pause. Silas could hear muffled conversation in the background. The officer came back on. "Sir, we're showing the lighthouse operating at standard parameters. Our monitoring system indicates 15-second intervals with no variation." "Then your monitoring system is wrong, or something is happening to the light after it leaves the lighthouse. I'm telling you what I'm seeing." "Can you provide your exact position?" Silas gave his coordinates again. The officer asked him to hold while he consulted with someone. When he came back, his tone had changed slightly. "Sir, we have another vessel operating about 12 miles south of your position. They're reporting normal lighthouse function. 15-second intervals, no patterns." That stopped Silas. If someone else was watching the same lighthouse from a different position and seeing normal operation, then what was happening to make it appear different to him? "That doesn't make sense," Silas said. "Light travels in straight lines. If the lighthouse is flashing normally, everyone should see the same thing. Unless there's something between you and the lighthouse affecting the light. Atmospheric conditions, temperature inversions, could create optical effects." Silas looked at the lighthouse, watching the 222 pattern continue. "This isn't an optical effect. This is the light itself changing." The Coast Guard officer suggested that Silas change position, move to different coordinates, and see if the pattern persisted. Silas agreed, though he didn't think location would make a difference. He motored south for about 3 miles, then stopped and watched the lighthouse again. The pattern had changed. Now it was 4 flashes, pause, 4 flashes, repeat 444. "Tilda," Silas said quietly, "it's responding to us. The pattern changes when we change position." She stared at him. "That's not possible." "I know. But look at it. We moved, and it immediately changed what it's doing." They watched for another 10 minutes. The 444 pattern never varied. Silas tried moving again, this time heading north. As soon as he changed course, the lighthouse pattern changed. Now it was one long continuous beam, not flashing at all. Just solid light. A lighthouse that didn't flash was like a heartbeat that didn't beat. It violated the fundamental purpose of the structure. Silas felt his skin crawl watching that unbroken light. "We need to go in," Tilda said. Her voice was shaking slightly. "Something is really wrong here." Silas agreed. He turned the boat toward San Simeon and increased speed, wanting to get back to port quickly. As they moved closer to shore, the lighthouse returned to normal operation. 15-second intervals, consistent and regular, the way it was supposed to be. They docked just after midnight. Kellen was waiting for them, which meant the Coast Guard had contacted him again. He listened to Silas's description of the evening's observations without interrupting. "The Coast Guard is taking this seriously now," Kellen said when Silas finished. "They're sending an investigation team to Point Sur. They want to install additional monitoring equipment, cameras that can record the light output from multiple angles." "Good. Maybe they'll finally see what's actually happening." "Maybe. But Silas, I need to ask you something. Is there any possibility you're being affected by something? Carbon monoxide from your engine, some kind of poisoning that could cause hallucinations?" Silas had expected this question. "Tilda sees it too. We can't both be hallucinating the same thing." Kellen looked at Tilda, who nodded confirmation. "It's real," she said. "Whatever's affecting that lighthouse is real." The investigation team arrived 3 days later and spent a week at Point Sur, installing cameras and sensors around the lighthouse structure. They monitored the light output continuously, comparing what the cameras recorded to what the control systems indicated. The results were impossible. The cameras showed the lighthouse flashing at 15-second intervals, exactly as the control systems indicated. But on certain nights, observers positioned at various locations offshore reported seeing different patterns. The patterns varied by position, with some locations seeing normal operation, while others saw the same anomalous flashing Silas had witnessed. The investigation team couldn't explain it. The light output was consistent. What left the lighthouse was a standard 15-second pattern, but somewhere between the lighthouse and certain observation points, the light changed. It organized itself into patterns that shouldn't exist. The lead investigator called Silas and asked him detailed questions about his observations. What direction he'd been facing, what the weather conditions were, whether he'd noticed anything unusual in the water. Silas answered as accurately as he could, but he had no explanation for what he'd seen. "We're documenting this as an atmospheric phenomenon," the investigator finally said. "Some kind of light refraction or reflection that's creating the appearance of pattern variation. It's unusual, but it's the only explanation that fits the evidence." "You're saying it's an optical illusion?" "I'm saying that the lighthouse itself is functioning correctly, but something between the lighthouse and certain observation points is affecting how the light appears. What that something is, we're still trying to determine." The investigation concluded without reaching any definitive conclusions. The lighthouse continued operating normally, its systems unchanged. The anomalous patterns were documented but not explained, filed away as an unusual occurrence that would require further study. Silas continued fishing the waters off San Simeon. He still used Point Sur Lighthouse as a navigation reference, but he no longer trusted what he saw. Some nights the light flashed normally. Other nights it patterned, creating sequences that looked deliberate and meaningful. Tilda stopped working night fishing runs after a month. She said the patterns bothered her, made her feel like something was trying to communicate using the lighthouse as a medium. She couldn't explain what that something might be, but she didn't want to be offshore watching it happen anymore. Other fishermen began reporting similar observations. Not all of them, but enough to establish that this wasn't isolated to Silas's perception. The patterns were real, or at least the observation of patterns was real, even if nobody could explain the mechanism. The whale behavior in the area normalized over time. The humpbacks returned to their expected migration patterns. Their vocalizations returned to normal frequencies. Whatever had been affecting them seemed to have passed, or perhaps just stopped being noticeable. But the lighthouse patterns continued intermittently. Silas documented them whenever they occurred, filling notebooks with sequences and timings. He looked for meaning in the patterns, tried to decode them as if they were messages, but found nothing that made sense. 321. 531 222 444. The numbers varied, but they were always counting or repeating, always simple, as if whatever was creating the patterns was using the most basic form of communication it could manage. Silas showed his notebooks to a mathematics professor at the nearby university, asking if the sequences had any significance. The professor studied them for several days before admitting he couldn't find any mathematical pattern or code. The sequences appeared random, though their consistent structure suggested intentionality. If this is communication, the professor said, it's at a level too simple for me to interpret. It's like someone showing you individual letters without forming words. You can see that they're trying to convey something, but you can't understand what. Years passed. Silas kept fishing, kept watching the lighthouse, kept documenting the patterns when they appeared. The phenomenon never explained itself, never resolved into something understandable. It just persisted, a mystery that existed in the gap between what instruments recorded and what eyes observed. Kellen retired from his position as port warden and was replaced by someone who'd never witnessed the patterns personally. The new warden heard the stories but filed them as local folklore, interesting but not requiring official attention. Silas is older now, thinking about retirement himself. His notebooks fill a shelf in his house, years of documentation that proves nothing except that he and others saw something inexplicable. The lighthouse still stands at Point Sewer, still flashes every 15 seconds, still guides ships along the coast. And on some nights, for some observers, it still counts, still flashes in patterns that shouldn't be possible, still attempts to communicate something using the only language it has. Light and darkness, presence and absence, numbers that mean nothing and might mean everything. Silas doesn't know what the patterns are trying to say. He doesn't know if they're trying to say anything at all, or if he's just seeing order in randomness, meaning in mechanical malfunction. But he keeps watching, keeps documenting, keeps trying to understand. Because something is there, in the space between the lighthouse and the observer. Something that bends light into patterns, that organizes photons according to rules that don't belong to physics. Something that counts with patient persistence night after night, waiting for someone to understand. The light flashes. 15 seconds. Standard, normal, except when it isn't. And Silas watches, counting in his head, wondering if tonight will be the night when the pattern finally makes sense. Harlan Evick was checking his nets in the pre-dawn darkness when the radio transmission came through. 3 words repeated with mechanical precision that made his hand stop moving on the mesh he was mending. The voice was flat, uninflected, neither male nor female, speaking English with an accent that came from no region Harlan could identify. Come inside. Come inside. Come inside. The transmission ended. Static filled the silence that followed, and Harlan stood on his deck staring at the radio as if the equipment itself had betrayed some fundamental trust. 28 years working fishing boats out of various Pacific coast ports had given him familiarity with every kind of radio communication. Weather reports, distress calls, Coast Guard broadcasts, the informal chatter between fishing vessels. But he had never heard anything like this. His boat, the Northern Grace, was tied at a dock in Bandon, Oregon. The harbor was quiet, most of the fleet still sleeping before the early morning departure. Harlan had come down early to prep his equipment, wanting to be first out to a productive spot he'd found the previous week. The harbor was safe, secure, completely protected from the ocean swell by the breakwater. There was no reason for anyone to broadcast a shelter-in-place message. Harlan checked his weather radio, thinking perhaps there had been an emergency broadcast he'd missed. The forecast showed typical late March conditions: overcast, light winds from the northwest, seas 2 to 4 feet. No storm warnings, no advisories, nothing that would trigger an evacuation alert. He tried his marine radio, switching through channels, listening for any indication of what the broadcast had been about. The frequencies were quiet, carrying only the occasional automatic weather update and the distant chatter of commercial vessels far offshore. Ruthie Belvoir appeared on the dock around 5:30, earlier than usual. Ruthie worked as a tender, moving between fishing vessels and handling logistics that kept the fleet operating efficiently. She was maybe 40, compact and precise in her movements, with a reputation for knowing everything that happened in any harbor she worked. "You hear that radio call?" she asked as she approached Harlan's boat. "The come inside message?" "Yeah. Came through on the emergency frequency. Scared the hell out of me." "You know what it was about?" Ruthie shook her head. "I called the Coast Guard. They said they didn't broadcast anything. Said it might have been interference from a commercial station or someone's radio malfunctioning." "That wasn't malfunction," Harlan said. "That was deliberate. Someone transmitted that message intentionally. I know. But the Coast Guard says there's no emergency. No reason for anyone to be calling for people to shelter. They checked with local authorities, checked the weather service, checked everything. No alerts, no incidents, nothing." Harlan looked out at the harbor. The water was calm, the sky just beginning to lighten with the approaching dawn. Boats sat quietly at their slips, undisturbed. Everything appeared completely normal. "You going out today?" Ruthie asked. "Planning to. You think I shouldn't?" She hesitated, and in that pause, Harlan read uncertainty. Ruthie wasn't someone who spooked easily. If she was questioning whether boats should go out, that meant something about the transmission had bothered her more than she was saying. "I think it's probably nothing," she finally said. But that voice, the way it sounded, it wasn't human. I mean, it was a human voice, but the quality was wrong, too flat, like a recording that had been processed to remove all emotion. "Text-to-speech?" Harlan suggested. "Maybe, but why would someone broadcast a text-to-speech message telling people to come inside when there's no emergency?" They didn't have an answer for that. Ruthie continued her rounds while Harlan finished his prep work. Other fishermen started arriving at the dock, and Harlan overheard several conversations about the radio transmission. Everyone had heard it. Everyone was confused about its source and purpose. Cathal Ormond, who owned a trawler that worked the same grounds as Harlan, called him around 6 o'clock. Cathal rarely came down to the dock anymore, managing his boat operations from an office in town, while younger crew did the actual fishing work. "Harlan, you planning to take the Grace out today?" "That's the plan." "Why?" "I'm thinking of keeping my boat in port. Something about that radio message doesn't sit right with me. Coast Guard says there's no emergency." "I know what they say, but I've been working these waters for 43 years, and I've learned to trust my instincts. The transmission felt like a warning." "Warning of what?" "Don't know, but I'm not sending my crew out until I understand where that message came from and why it was broadcast." Harlan respected Cathal's experience, but he also needed to fish. He'd had a slow week and couldn't afford to miss a day on the water based on a vague feeling of unease. He told Cathal he'd be careful, would monitor his radio and weather instruments closely, and would return immediately if conditions changed. The Northern Grace departed Bandon Harbor at 6:45, heading northwest toward the fishing grounds. Harlan worked alone this trip, having given his regular deckhand time off to deal with family matters. The ocean was calm, just as the forecast had predicted, with gentle swells from the northwest and clear visibility extending for miles. Harlan reached his fishing spot around 7:30 and began deploying nets. The work was routine, familiar, requiring attention but not demanding the kind of focus that prevented awareness of surroundings. He kept his radio on, listening for any additional broadcasts, any explanation of the morning's strange message. The radio remained quiet except for standard traffic. Weather updates, fishing vessels reporting their positions, the Coast Guard conducting radio checks. Everything normal. Harlan was hauling his second set of nets around 9 o'clock when the transmission came through again. "Come inside, come inside, come inside." Same voice, same flat mechanical quality, same 3 words repeated. The transmission ended abruptly, leaving static. Harlan grabbed his microphone and responded, asking who was broadcasting and what the message meant. There was no reply. He tried multiple frequencies, broadcasting requests for clarification, but received no response. He checked his position. He was approximately 8 miles offshore, in water he'd fished dozens of times before. The weather remained calm, the ocean undisturbed. There was nothing in his immediate environment that suggested danger or emergency. But the message had been clear: come inside, get to shelter, return to port. Harlan made a decision. He secured his nets and turned the Northern Grace toward Bandon, increasing speed to make good time back to harbor. If nothing else, he could check with the Coast Guard directly, get a better understanding of what was happening. The run back took 45 minutes. As Harlan approached the harbor entrance, he noticed other boats were also returning, converging on the breakwater from multiple directions. The radio traffic had increased, with fishermen asking each other if they'd heard the second transmission, wondering what it meant. The Coast Guard station at Bandon was busy when Harlan arrived. A dozen fishermen had congregated there, all asking the same questions. A young officer was trying to maintain order, explaining repeatedly that the Coast Guard had not broadcast any emergency messages, had no information about who had, and was investigating the source of the transmissions. "Could be a prank," the officer said. "Someone with radio equipment broadcasting false messages. It's illegal, and we're taking it seriously, but there's no actual emergency." "Then why did you all come back to port?" one fisherman asked. The question hung in the air. Nobody had an official reason for returning. The weather was good, the fishing was productive. There was no rational explanation for abandoning a workday based on 3 words from an unidentified source. But they'd all come back anyway, responding to something in that flat mechanical voice that suggested genuine warning. Harlan spent an hour at the Coast Guard station, listening to speculation and theories. Nobody had answers. The prevailing opinion was that someone was playing a dangerous joke, broadcasting fake emergency messages that disrupted fishing operations and potentially endangered lives if people responded inappropriately. He was walking back to his boat when he encountered Ruthie again. She was standing on the dock, staring out at the ocean beyond the breakwater. Her posture was tense, her attention focused on the horizon in a way that made Harlan stop. "What are you looking at?" he asked. "Nothing," she said. "That's the problem. I'm looking at nothing." Harlan moved to stand beside her. The ocean was calm, the sky clear. He could see for miles in every direction. "I don't understand." "No boats," Ruthie said. "Look at the water. How many boats do you see working offshore?" Harlan scanned the visible ocean. She was right, there were no boats. The fishing grounds that should have been populated with working vessels were empty. Everyone had come back to port after the second transmission. "We all heard the same thing," Ruthie said quietly. "We all decided to come inside. Every single boat working these waters this morning made the same decision without communicating with each other, without coordinating. That's not normal behavior." She was right. Fishermen were independent, stubborn, not prone to following warnings without good reason. The fact that the entire fleet had returned to port based on a cryptic 3-word message suggested something deeper than simple caution. The third transmission came through at noon. Harlan was on his boat, secured at the dock, when the radio crackled to life with that same flat voice. Come inside, come inside, come inside. This time there was something else, a background sound beneath the words. A low frequency hum that Harlan felt more than heard, a vibration that seemed to resonate in his chest. The transmission lasted perhaps 10 seconds, longer than the previous broadcasts, and when it ended, the silence felt heavier than before. Harlan climbed out of his boat and walked to where several other fishermen had gathered on the main dock. Everyone looked shaken, disturbed by something they couldn't articulate. That sound, one of them said. Did you hear that sound underneath the words? They'd all heard it. None of them could describe it accurately, but they'd all felt it. That subsonic pressure that had accompanied the transmission. Cathal Ormond arrived at the dock around 1 o'clock, which was unusual. Cathal rarely left his office to come down to the harbor personally. He found Harlan and pulled him aside, his expression grave. I've been making calls, Cathal said. Talking to people at other harbors, checking if they've heard these transmissions. You want to know what I found? Harlan nodded. It's not just Bandon. Coos Bay heard it. Port Orford heard it. As far north as Newport and as far south as Crescent City. Every harbor along this section of coast has been receiving these transmissions, all saying the same thing, come inside. What's the Coast Guard saying? They're investigating. But they're also getting concerned. This isn't someone with a handheld radio playing a prank. The signal is too strong, too widespread. Whoever is broadcasting has access to serious equipment, and they're doing it deliberately. Broadcasting what, though? There's no emergency. The weather is perfect. There's no reason for anyone to be inside. Cathal looked out at the ocean, his eyes tracking the horizon. Maybe there's no reason yet. Maybe the message is warning about something that hasn't happened. The idea chilled Harlan more than he wanted to admit. Warnings about future events implied knowledge that shouldn't exist, prediction that went beyond weather forecasting or normal risk assessment. The afternoon passed without additional transmissions. The Coast Guard issued an advisory asking all vessels to remain vigilant, but assuring everyone that there was no known threat. Several fishermen decided to go back out, unwilling to lose an entire day's income based on mysterious radio messages. Harlan stayed in port. He couldn't explain his decision logically, but something in those transmissions had created a conviction that going back on the water would be a mistake. Ruthie stayed as well, sitting on the dock and watching the ocean with that same focused attention she'd displayed earlier. Around 4 o'clock, one of the boats that had gone back out radioed to report strange sonar readings. The captain described his depth sounder showing inconsistent returns, as if the bottom was rising and falling in ways that didn't match the known topology. Could be instrument malfunction, the Coast Guard responded. Return to port and have your equipment checked. The captain agreed and started heading back. 2 other boats reported similar sonar anomalies over the next hour. All of them returned to port, their captains unsettled by readings that made no sense. The 4th transmission came at sunset. Come inside, come inside, come inside. The background hum was louder this time, more pronounced. Harlan felt it in his bones, a frequency that seemed to interfere with normal perception. The transmission lasted maybe 15 seconds, and when it ended, several people on the dock reported feeling dizzy or disoriented. Ruthie grabbed Harlan's arm, her grip tight enough to be painful. Look at the water. Harlan looked. The ocean beyond the breakwater was still calm, but something about it had changed. The color was wrong, darker than it should be in the fading light, and the surface had a quality that Harlan couldn't quite identify, a flatness that went beyond simple calm. It's too still, Ruthie said. Water doesn't move like that. Even in calm conditions, There's always some motion that's like glass. She was right. The ocean had stopped moving entirely. No waves, no ripples, no indication of current or wind effect. Just perfect absolute stillness extending from the harbor entrance to the horizon. People started noticing. Conversations stopped as fishermen and dock workers gathered to stare at the impossible calm. Someone tried throwing a rock from the breakwater, and they watched as it hit the surface and disappeared without creating the expected splash or ripples. The water simply accepted the impact and returned to its glassy stillness. The Coast Guard officer who had been answering questions all day came down to the dock and stood staring at the ocean with everyone else. He pulled out his radio and made several calls, his voice tight with controlled alarm. "We need everyone away from the water," he finally said, loud enough for the gathered crowd to hear. "Please move back from the edge, return to your vehicles or the harbor buildings." "What's happening?" someone asked. "I don't know, but we're treating this as a potential emergency until we understand what we're seeing." People started moving away from the waterfront, climbing up to the parking area or entering the harbor office building. Harlan found himself walking backward, unwilling to turn away from the ocean, needing to watch whatever was going to happen. The sun dropped below the horizon, and darkness began to settle over the harbor. The water remained impossibly still, darker now, reflecting nothing. Harlan could see the lights from the harbor buildings touching the surface but not penetrating it, as if the ocean had become opaque. Then, slowly, the water began to rise. Not like a wave, not like a tide, just a gradual increase in level, the surface maintaining its glassy stillness while it climbed. The boats tied at the docks started lifting with the rising water, their mooring lines going taut. "Everyone inside now," the Coast Guard officer shouted. "Move away from the water." Harlan ran with the others toward the harbor office, a solid concrete building that sat on high ground above the docks. He made it inside and pushed through the crowd to a window where he could see the waterfront. The water was still rising, spilling over the docks now, flooding the parking area. But it wasn't moving like water should. It rose with perfect uniformity, maintaining that glassy quality, climbing over obstacles without turbulence or spray. And it was absolutely silent. Water makes noise when it moves, splashing and rushing sounds. This made no sound at all. The rising stopped when it reached perhaps 10 feet above normal high tide level. The water held there, perfectly level, perfectly still, covering the docks and the lower parking area but not advancing further up the slope. Then the transmission came through one final time, loud enough that everyone in the building could hear it through the radios that several people had brought with them. "Come inside, come inside, come inside." The background hum was overwhelming now, making it difficult to think clearly. Harlan felt his vision blur, felt the room tilt around him. People were grabbing onto walls and furniture, trying to stay upright as the subsonic frequency did something to their sense of balance. The transmission ended. The hum faded, and slowly the water began to recede. It dropped at the same gradual rate it had risen, sinking back toward the normal levels while maintaining that impossible stillness. Within 10 minutes it had returned to standard tide height, and within another 10 minutes the surface began showing normal motion again. Small waves appeared, driven by the evening breeze. The ocean became ocean again, moving and alive rather than that flat, dead thing it had been. The Coast Guard office in Coos Bay sent additional personnel to Bandon that evening. They interviewed everyone who had witnessed the rising water, documented the high water marks that had been left on buildings and vehicles, measured the extent of the flooding. But they couldn't explain what had happened. Water doesn't rise uniformly like that, doesn't maintain perfect levelness across an entire harbor. Water doesn't stay glassy still while it climbs over obstacles, and water doesn't recede with the same mechanical precision it advances. The radio transmission stopped after the water receded. No more warnings, no more flat mechanical voices telling people to come inside. The emergency frequency returned to normal use, carrying only standard broadcast and traffic. Investigation of the incident continued for weeks. Scientists studied water samples, though they found nothing unusual. Seismologists checked for earthquake activity that might have caused localized sea level changes but found no seismic events. Meteorologists analyzed atmospheric conditions, looking for explanations in air pressure or temperature inversions, but found nothing that would account for what had been observed. The official conclusion was that Bandon Harbor had experienced an unusual tidal phenomenon, possibly related to seismic activity too subtle to be detected by instruments. The radio transmissions were classified as a separate incident, likely someone who had knowledge of the approaching tidal event and had tried to warn people using anonymous broadcasts. But that explanation satisfied nobody who had actually witnessed what happened. Harlan had seen water behave in ways that violated every principle of fluid dynamics he'd learned in 40-odd years of working boats, and he'd heard that voice, that flat, mechanical warning that had come hours before anything actually happened. The fishing fleet returned to normal operations within a few days. Boats went out, catches came in. Life continued as if the incident had never occurred. But everyone who had been in Bandon that day carried the memory of that glassy water, that silent rising, that subsonic hum that had made thinking difficult. Harlan still fishes the same waters, still ties up at Bandon Harbor. But he keeps his radio on at all times now, listening for any hint of that flat, mechanical voice. And he's learned to recognize a certain quality in the water, a stillness that goes just slightly beyond normal calm. When he sees it, he returns to port immediately, even if the weather is perfect and the fishing is good. Ruthie left the coast entirely. She moved inland, took a job that had nothing to do with water or boats. She told Harlan before she left that she couldn't shake the feeling that the rising water hadn't been natural, that something had deliberately manipulated the ocean that day, demonstrating capability that humans shouldn't witness. Cathal sold his trawler and retired. He said he was getting too old for the work anyway, but Harlan knew the real reason. Cathal had been right to trust his instincts, to keep his boat in port that day, and that rightness scared him more than being wrong ever had, because it meant the warnings had been real, the danger had been real, and nobody understood where either had come from. The radio transmissions have never been conclusively sourced. The Coast Guard investigation identified several possible origins but couldn't confirm any of them. The most likely explanation was a powerful transmitter on a vessel offshore, but no vessel was ever identified, and the signal strength suggested equipment that would be difficult to hide on a boat. Harlan thinks about those transmissions often, particularly the timing. The warnings had come hours before the water rose, giving people time to get clear, to move away from the docks and the waterfront. Whoever sent them had known what was going to happen, and they'd tried to protect people. But they'd also known that what was going to happen would sound impossible if described directly, so they'd used the simplest possible warning. Come inside, get away from the water, seek shelter. And everyone who heard it had responded, even though they didn't understand why. Some instinct deeper than rational thought had recognized the warning for what it was, had overridden the logical assessment that everything was fine. The ocean beyond Bandon Harbor looks normal most days now. Boats work the fishing grounds, tourists walk the beaches, life continues in all the ordinary ways. But sometimes, on certain evenings when the light is fading and the wind is calm, the water takes on that glassy quality again. That absolute stillness that shouldn't exist. When that happens, people who know move away from the waterfront. They don't discuss it, don't question it. They just come inside, seeking shelter from something they can't name but instinctively fear. and they listen to their radios, wondering if they'll hear that flat mechanical voice again, wondering if the warning will come in time, wondering what controls water like that, what makes it rise in defiance of physics, what knows enough about the future to broadcast warnings before danger arrives. The questions remain unanswered. The water keeps its secrets, and the voice, wherever it came from, stays silent.